Hola, buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this event on tax policy as a key to move towards environment and climate justice in Latin America. This event is set on the third day on environment and human rights justice. And it is part of a discussion that we've been proposing with different organizations to promote a broad and open discussion on what should be tax policies in Latin America and what's going on around those policies in terms of climate and environment justice, and how can we contribute to improve management and policies that we have in our countries. The event is organized by the Center on Social and Economic Rights, the CESR, and WWF Colombia. I'm Mauricio Cabrera. I am advisor in government relationships in WWF, and we really like to thank you for joining us in this event. So the idea is, through a couple of presentations that we will have with panel members about the different topics surrounding tax policy and environment and climate justice in Latin America and the Caribbean. And after these presentations, we will have some conversations and a Q&A session from those of us joining us. So we will generate a discussion and we will see what we can contribute on for this improvement of the tax policy in Latin America. So we would like to apologize because one of the panel members had a problem related to the pandemic that we're going through right now, and she won't be able to join us. It's Maria Fernanda Valdez. However, we are going to have the opportunity to play a short video that she recorded for us. And we are going to develop with the rest of the team as it was scheduled. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panel members. We have Aroa de la Fuente, Alejandro Rodríguez, Sofía Garzón, and Ivana La Rosa. So we are going to start. And before that, let me remind you that we will have in Portuguese and English simultaneous interpreting. For this, we ask the panel members to speak slowly and paused so we can have the interpreting services properly carried out. So now I will pass the floor to Aroa de la Fuente, and she will be the first panel member to present. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank from Hefelac for inviting me to this relevant conversation today. So I will open with a presentation, this session that invites us to reflect on the role that tax policy plays on environment and climate current situations that, as you well know, are
actuar de
urgent
manera
and serious
urgente.
and invite
Y
us
bueno,
to
estamos
act
muy contentas de
urgently.
estar acá
And we
porque
are very
este
glad to
trabajo
be here
es
because
parte
this work
fundamental
is
del trabajo que
fundamental
venimos
part
realizando
of the
en
work that
GFLAC
we've been doing
desde el
and
inicio,
GFLAC.
¿no? Somos el grupo
From
de
the
financiamiento
beginning, we
climático para
are
Latinoamérica y
the
el Caribe y
climate
básicamente
financing group
nos
for
abocamos a
Latin America and the
analizar y a
Caribbean, and
actuar
we dedicate to
sobre
analyze and act
financiamiento para
on
cambio climático
financing and
y
funding for
una de
climate
las
change.
líneas de trabajo es sobre el financiamiento público.
And one of
¿no?
our
Por
work
eso
lines is public
estamos acá
funding.
y
So that's why we're
para
here
nosotras
today.
ha sido siempre muy importante no solo
And for us, it
centrar
has always been important not only
la atención en el
to
tema del
focus the
presupuesto,
attention on
obviamente es muy
budget,
importante
which is of
cuáles son las
course very
inversiones que están
important,
viendo
to
para
go over
estos
the
temas, pero
situations
también en la
that are
parte
addressed
de ingresos,
related to
¿no? En
this,
una
but also
integralidad
income
de las políticas
in
fiscales
comprehension
de los
of
países,
tax
en el
policies
entendido
in
de que pues, también
countries,
los ingresos impactan
understanding that
positiva o negativa, la
income
forma en que se
impact
generan esos ingresos
positive or
pueden impactar de
negatively
forma negativa o positiva
in the
en las
countries depending on how they are
temáticas que queremos. Y
generated.
justamente, ¿se
And
ve mi presentación?
you can see my presentation, right?
Sí, ¿verdad?
Yes, right?
Sí, se
¿Sí
ve.
se puede ver?
Yes,
voy a
of
poner
course.
la pantalla completa para ponerla en modo presentación.
But let me just see this.
Y en ese sentido, pues hoy venimos a presentarles una herramienta que acabamos de publicar este año, que es el índice de finanzas sostenibles. Y déjenme primero contarles un poquito cuál es la motivación, ¿no? Como todas y todos sabemos, nos encontramos en un momento de emergencia climática que nos llama a actuar de manera urgente. Necesitamos reducir en al menos 45% las emisiones globales de gases de efecto invernadero para 2030 si es que queremos limitar, ¿no? El aumento de la temperatura global a 1.5 grados centígrados. Y sin embargo, lo que estamos viendo es que las políticas de los países a nivel global y en América Latina no están respondiendo necesariamente a esta urgencia. Un ejemplo de ello es que las actuales contribuciones nacionalmente determinadas nos llevarían a un escenario de más de 3 grados centígrados, ¿no? Y en este ámbito, pues, urge que esas políticas se fortalezcan, que esas políticas vayan más allá, y en ese sentido, pues, el financiamiento, ¿no? Como lo dice el propio Acuerdo de París, pues, no basta solo con que pensemos en qué vamos a estar invirtiendo en sostenibilidad, en cambio climático, sino que todos los flujos de financiamiento deben alinearse, ¿no? Con el desarrollo de bajo emisiones y resiliente al clima. Eso es muy importante, ¿no? Justo por este tema que les hablábamos, no es suficiente invertir recursos públicos, digamos, o de otro tipo a cambio climático, sino también repensar toda la política fiscal para poder atender estos temas. Y bueno, el financiamiento público obviamente es clave, aunque hay otros tipos de financiamiento en los que también hay que poner atención y que también deben atender este tema. Pues el financiamiento público es clave para detonar como estas acciones. Entonces, bueno, por eso nosotras nos dimos a la tarea de crear el índice de presupuestos sostenibles, que pues, es una herramienta que lo que busca básicamente es poder monitorear y evaluar el desempeño de los países sobre los ingresos y egresos.
Es que tu presentación no se está viendo ahorita después de que leíste pantalla completa, parece como un fondo negro. Quizás si quieres dejarla como en la pantalla anterior. Para que...
a ver, me avisan si se ve. Por favor. ¿Se ve?
Perfecto.
Now, can you see it now?
Entonces, bueno,
okay, perfect.
Esta es la que ya les había hablado de la
motivación. So this is the one that
I've
already told you about motivation, and now this is the budget index.
Entonces, bueno, como les decía, ¿no? El índice de presupuestos es una herramienta que nos permite monitorear los ingresos y egresos que tienen los países para atender el cambio climático, así como los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible que se asocian al mismo. Y también, en este sentido, nos interesaba medir
we were also interested in measuring what were those income and outcome that could be hindering progress towards these goals. And, of course, with the aim of identifying gaps and opportunities existing and promoting actions at a country level that allow to address them. In this 2020 edition, we applied it to the 21 countries that are the most issuers, and now I'm going to show you the results
para no alargarme mucho y hacerlo más escueto, hablar, el índice está compuesto también de una serie de indicadores que nos permite contextualizar a los países, ¿no? En temas ambientales, económicos, social and political context. El núcleo, digamos, del índice está compuesto de una serie de variables que es la que finalmente posiciona a los países, ¿no? en cuanto a su desempeño en finanzas sostenibles. La primera variable son los ingresos sostenibles, que son aquellos provenientes de cooperación y financiamiento, de fuentes bilaterales y multilaterales dedicadas al cambio climático. La segunda variable son los ingresos intensivos en carbono, que denominamos así a todos los ingresos que provienen de la recaudación tributaria y no tributaria, de la exploración y extracción de hidrocarburos y minerales, así como los impuestos a los combustibles. La tercera variable son los presupuestos sostenibles, que incluye el presupuesto etiquetado para cambio climático dentro del sector ambiental, el presupuesto etiquetado de eficiencia energética y energía renovable dentro del sector energético, y por último, el presupuesto etiquetado para desastres naturales. Esto dentro, en cada país varía, entonces lo basamos en la institución que coordina en cada país esta política. Y por último, tenemos el presupuesto intensivo en carbono, que es lo que incluye básicamente aquel presupuesto que ha sido asignado a la explotación por los países. ¿Cuáles son los resultados?
So what are the results? Let's go over
en la primera variable, que es el ranking.
The first variable, which is sustainable income ranking, as I said, this is ranked by countries in a general ranking that I will present at the end. But the first variable shows
como pueden ver en la gráfica,
that, as you can see on the graph, funding dedicated to climate change has been focused
más concentrado y asignado en un número limitado de países.
In a limited number of countries, so geographically there is a geographical imbalance in assigning this type of research. So almost all of the countries are focused in this group of 6 countries. And also, theme-wise, we see the vulnerability of the emission facing vulnerability due to emissions. So it still receives the most important part of these resources in concrete 7-fold more than adapting efforts, which is also very important to address in order to be able to face the effects. In terms of intensive carbon income ranking, I think the graph kind of speaks by itself. All of the countries receive more or less income, whether it's for extraction or exploitation of mineral or hydrocarbon. And when they don't have those activities, they receive it for fuel. And these still have an impact on climate change. And of course, there are specific countries, such as Ecuador, Mexico, Trinidad and Tobago, where income are high. The tax institution that works for this type of problems show that it's quite high, and of course, this shows more consequences that make it harder to leave behind this type of activities, which is urgent facing the climate emergency. In terms of sustainable
en estas áreas que les comentamos es que ninguno de los países analizados
budget ranking, none of the analyzed countries has the right budget assignment. It didn't go over 1% of total budget.
El caso de
Jamaica, que in the case of Jamaica, which is the one that
destinó, como ven, se quedó en 0.58,
seen in 0.8, but there were other countries that destined even less than that. So of course, this proposes serious challenges if we want to address sustainability aspects.
Y por último, en el ranking de
presupuestos intensivos en carbono, pues lo que vemos un poco es ranking,
que hay países, ¿no? Que invirtieron una parte muy importante de sus presupuestos en la explotación de hidrocarburos a nivel del presupuesto total, y luego si nos vamos al sector energético,
and if we go towards the energy sector, it's even greater. So it is quite impressive how countries still their power matrix and their funding in terms of energy are completely
la balanza está totalmente inclinada hacia la explotación de hidrocarburos
towards exploiting hydrocarbon facing other
Entonces, bueno, este es el ranking de finanzas sostenibles.
So this is the Sustainable Finance Ranking, and it aims to position countries. I mean, ones are enough these four variables. Now, of course, this does not mean that a country such as Honduras, which is the best positioned one, this does not mean that this ranking is in comparison among countries. I mean, it doesn't mean that 3.2 means that it's in an ideal situation, but we have to consider this compared with other countries, because as you've seen, variables do not really have a budget allocation, and there's not income that's excellent in the matter, you know? So let me just contextualize this data, and there are some comparisons that are interesting. First, we have sustainable.
Intensivos en carbono, y ahí lo que vemos es que, ¿no? Los ingresos intensivos,
what we see is that intensive income,
viéndolo por países,
I mean, seeing it per
a veces
countries,
podemos ver que hay países que menos, hay países que más.
Sometimes there are countries that, if we consider the ensemble of the countries, intensive income from these 21
superan en 196 veces los ingresos sostenibles.
Go over 26-fold sustainable efforts. So, of course,
este tipo de ingresos pues predomina, ¿no? Frente a otro tipo de ingresos que pueden
and this predominates over some income that can bring us towards a sustainable development. And carbon-intensive efforts are more than sustainable income.
En la parte de presupuestos, lo que encontramos es que para el conjunto de los 21 países,
so what we have for 21 countries is that they assign 43 times more intensive budget in carbon than sustainable carbon, with a total assignment.
Del presupuesto de todos los países frente al 0,09.
So all of the countries are compared to the sustainable. And the budget
supera al presupuesto sostenible, pero
for hydrocarbon overcomes the sustainable budget. But let me show you the next graph, which is the same, but seen from energy sectors of these 21 countries. We see a predominance. The gray part is hydrocarbon part. We see a total predominance of hydrocarbons facing other energy sources, especially when we are talking about renewable energy. This is 26% of the power sector that's going to hydrocarbon, facing 0.2% of renewable energy. And this makes it to go over 53 folds.
Y que en 14 de los 21 países el presupuesto para hidrocarburos en el sector energético supera.
So the energy sector overcomes the budget.
Y un último dato que nos parece
and the last data that we found interesting is that we wanted to have an estimate of what would be necessary in order to be able to address the challenges associated to this, so we could have a comparison with what's been truly assigned. And for this, we use this data that Nicolas presented in order to fight climate change. It was some years ago, but maybe now it's even greater. But we need the reference. So we would need investment of at least 2% of the GDP of the countries in order to address climate change. So the ensemble of the 21 countries would need 6.6% of the budget, the total budget dedicated to these actions, while in the areas that we have analyzed, it only testing 0.09% of the total budget. So the gap is still quite big, and there's a lot to do in order to reach what's being needed. And currently, probably maybe more.
Y bueno, pues ya para terminar un poco las conclusiones es que
in terms of income, as we've said, there is an inequitable limited sustainable income distribution that's not enough, and of course they are overcome by intensive income.
Y en materia de presupuesto,
and in terms of budget,
existen limitados
disponibles. Un momento, tenemos un problema porque la interpretación ahora se está mezclando con el audio de Aroa. No sé, Santiago, por favor, ¿podemos resolver?
Sí, por favor, estaba intentando manejarlo, pero sí es muy difícil.
Sí, ya no estoy asignada como intérprete, alguien me desasignó. Gracias.
Continúa, Aroa.
Sí, ya. ¿de acuerdo? En materia de presupuestos, como ya hemos dicho, pues son limitados los presupuestos sostenibles actualmente y son pues obviamente
sustainable, and of course they are intensive. Budget in carbon are more intensive in many countries, and there's a huge disparity between what's invested in sustainability and carbon intensive activities. So one of the main challenges that we've seen in order to carry out this index that I think we've all have had when we face tax policies and analyzing data are all of the challenges that we see in terms of information access. And in terms of climate change, this is especially important since on one part, we are facing the limited transparency that we already have, as well as unequal way to publish in the 21 countries, but there are still labels missing. We have an integration of the climate change and the budget sustainable efforts, and there are still methodologies missing to integrate it at a budgeting level, which makes it even further difficult to have an analysis. And last but not least, recommendations. In terms of income, it is necessary to improve and better define sustainable investment needs by countries in order to have an international cooperation that's focused on what's needed, increase the effectiveness of how these sustainable efforts are sustained and how they are invested, and to create national strategies to mobilize sustainable efforts. And we're also promoting discussions on tax reforms and amendments that are allowed to decarbonize public finances, create taxes to carbon, and only 4 countries of the region have it currently, and increasing the transparency of the existing countries, because those who have it are not publishing information on how they're using it. And in terms of budget, cross-sectionalize, which is fundamental. It cannot be that only environment sectors are in charge, but that it has to be a multi-sectorial aspect that crosses all of society sectors. Redirect intensive carbon project towards sustainable activities, which is fundamental. Align public finances to sustainable development, and in general, align, which is the most important aspect, and increase sustainable budget amount. And in terms of transparency and information access, we need to increase budget transparency. And in terms of climate and development, we need to develop sustainable classifiers and create and implement methodologies for the integration in a structural manner to the budget projects. And last but not least, create, measure, reporting, and verification systems for funding. And thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, please remember that this in-text can be seen in this webpage on screen. Thank you, Aroa. It is quite interesting. I think that this first presentation shows the status of finance on these topics, which is key. It shows how dependent we are in most of our countries, which is a dependency on hydrocarbons, an economic dependency that's focusing on mitigation more than adaptation, with all of the problems that we have, as well as acknowledging that our countries are completely vulnerable facing this. And I think that in order to propose a discussion for the end, these are the needs that we have, that we face to go towards new type of economies, and how difficult it is for national ones to be able to have those transitions. We become dependent, almost addicts, to these economies associated to hydrocarbons, gas, carbon, and transitioning becomes a very complex situation and subject. So thank you, Rob, for this first input. And in terms of human rights in tax policy as a tool to move forward towards justice, environmental and climate change justice, as I said, Maria Fernanda won't be able to join us today. However, Natalia Daza from Justicia will develop her topic. I don't know if we are going to first broadcast her welcoming words. There she is. So please go ahead. We don't have audio. That state should ensure that the tax policy representing a role. Sorry, we don't have good audio. This is a huge challenge of our generation, and it's the great input of this initiative. Well, so Natalia, I pass the floor to you so that you can further develop and elaborate. Thank you. I'm going to share a presentation. Good morning, everyone. Good day in general. My name is Natalia. I'm part of the Environment Justice Department and Justicia, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Principle 4, which is a principle that considers environment in the guidelines and principles of human rights in tax policy adhering to the Latin American context. The important aspect here is clarifying what is the relationship between tax policies and climate justice. So to start, I'm going to introduce the principles and guidelines, and some of you may already know due to other presentations, or you may be interested in knowing this week. So these principles and guidelines are a product of 3 years of comprehensive research, joint work with several regional organizations and global, as well as an inspiration that looks and aims to transform the tax pact between states, citizens, and companies so that the state action is oriented to guaranteeing human rights when it comes to tax policies. In turn, this will provide more trust in institutions and a greater willingness to pay for taxes. That will in turn work for human rights. So, what happens when this intersection happens? To start from the consulting opinion 2317, establishing that a healthy environment is a precondition for an effective warranty of the rest of human rights. In this sense, we need to make a space for environmental aspects, which is utterly important. So when there is an environment deterioration, as we can see in the climate crisis, human rights are also impacted in two ways. On one hand, in terms of the unavoidable impacts as a product of climate change and everything that this implies in terms of human rights, whether it's adapting climate change. Also, this implies mitigation plans. So, while it prevents violations on human rights, also these mitigation plans could cause a violation of human rights. So there is a double jeopardy here. And what does this have to do with tax policy? Well, strengthening health systems to address negative impact of pollution in health, for example, air condition. This is all related to climate change, and it is needed to invest in mitigation efforts, but it requires a tax policy that's coherent with this. And to this, we add that tax policy should also be coherent with human rights. And let me give you a couple of examples. For example, taxes to the one-use only plastic do not violate human rights. For example, people living in disability. For example, plastic straws, which are a straw that cannot be substituted easily. So people with disabilities still need it. So they can be affected by these decisions. It also happened with carbon tax and the regressiveness and what this implies, for example, for vulnerable populations. So, for example, what happens with energy taxes and the use of electrodomestic that reduce the non-paid load for women, workload for women. So these are dynamic that play a part. So it is not only having tax policy at the service of environment, so as such, for it to also be at the service of human rights. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Principle 4, which is a principle that addresses the environmental aspect within the principles and guidelines of human rights in tax policies. So Principle 4 establishes that states should ensure that its tax policy is environmentally sustainable. This means, on one hand, maximizing the use of resources, available resources, to ensure sustainable development. This, of course, in order to promote the enjoyment of a right of a healthy environment, prevent environmental damages, among others, and all of this framed within the right and development. This means that it is required a commitment by several governments following the principle of common responsibilities but differentiated ones. So countries, for example, that most emissions cause, US, China, India, and Russia, are the ones that undertake the higher responsibility in terms of, for example, mitigation projects and funding climate change, adapting to the most vulnerable countries that tend to be the ones that less emissions produce. Second, environmental use of tax policy. So seizing the potential of tax policy in biodiversity and mitigation and adaptation to climate change protection. Third is coherence, ensuring that tax policy is coherent and in conformity with environment policy at a national, subnational, and world level. This is key because of what we have been saying in terms of extractive activities and the dependence that this has meant in Latin American budgets. And last but not least, informed decisions. So abstaining from reinforcing the public funding dependency on activities of high environment impact that could risk human rights. And these decisions, when taken, they have to agree with the people's free auto-determination, that they are legitimate and sustainable for everyone, and that their benefit outweigh costs, and that they're properly distributed. So in this sense, guidelines are the following. One, using tax policy to promote the care of assets and environmental rights, including a transition towards clean energies, reducing both depending on extractive sectors as well as those activities that could cause negative impacts on human rights, including environmental rights. And to this, we add that they are sustainable in intergenerational matters and balance cost-benefit at a territorial level, which favor regional convergence and that are compatible with life projects of local communities. Second, articulate economic policies, including tax and finance and money regulation policies, to environmental and social policies, adding the promotion of the national inter and intra-coordination and the use of tax instruments that are green to properly distribute costs of environmental action, as well as preventing migration and relocation of activities from zones where there is an extensive use of environmental taxes to those that do not have it. this requires a regional and global cooperation on how these taxes, these green taxes, are going to be imposed. Third, incentivize through tax policy the investment on renewable energies, the creation of green employments, and reducing greenhouse effect emissions. To this, we are incorporating green taxes or environmental exemptions that are properly assessed, which prevent a negative effect on the environment, adding the incorporation of collection on green taxes. For example, carbon taxes are quite aggressive, but it doesn't deplete in its use. But what is done with that collection? There are many examples and models of what happens with money wire transfers that are focalized and even no focalized, and how this can help dissuading that carbon regressiveness. To this, we add using green tax collection or part of it to address climate action, as we have been saying before. We need to have ambitious goals, but beyond having this, it is also important to have funding in order to address it. And in turn, we also need funding for everything that's going to have to do with risk management, strengthening health services, strengthening care services. We know that climate change is gonna increase the number of non-paid work of women in terms of care because of the way it's established, so we need to consider how to fund them. 4, when natural resource exploitation are started, a reasonable part of the benefits has to be adhered to taxing, and power transition has to be accelerated so that it can guarantee human rights, especially where these activities happen. So destructive actions taxes have to be tested to fund transitions that, of course, need to be responsible with human rights. So the idea for this is not to turn into a new extractivism. It's very important to clarify. Transitions have to be according to human rights. And we have to add it to establishing mechanisms to capture resources derived to extraordinary income as a product of pricing boom, plus macroeconomic management of income coming from natural resources through the stabilization of funding and other ideal mechanisms, added to a promotion of productive diversification. And last but not least, managing public and hybrid companies, particularly in those extractive sectors, so the energy transition is accelerated and environmental damages can be prevented. And the last bullet of guidelines would be mounting tax incentives to non-renewable energy sources, ensuring protection or compensation of lesser income population, while publishing transparent information on the beneficiaries of these incentives. As we've been saying, it is important to consider subsidies to fuels, for example, but we know that since they are highly subsidized, this is going to have a negative impact in vulnerable communities. So we need to do it as in other policies. We have to help for this not to have a negative impact. And with these principles in mind, I'm very interested in quickly discussing what tax policy in terms of environment is, how it is in Latin America, and how these principles are going to be faced, and in which overview they're going to be developed. And it's very interesting for the conversation that we will have later on. So first, our green taxes. We know that there is an incipient application, especially for fossil and automobiles, introduced mainly with tax purposes. This is what we have in green taxes. Royalties, a sort of subsidy, in such a way that it is a tax relief to other non-related activities, not related to extraction activities. However, there are still a lot of disputes on what is the extent of these tax reliefs. So with this, we need to be very careful too. Presence of subsidies to energy, that's still a priority in terms of social policy. So once again, we ask about graduality, policies that accompany removing these energy subsidies that do not end up affecting more vulnerable communities, and highly subsidized fuels. And when introducing it to a lesser extent, there could be social discontent. a case of this could be gasoline in Mexico that had taxes on fossil fuels, and the importance, once again, of its graduality, its eventuality, as well as creating awareness on why these taxes are happening. Now, on tax and matters in terms of environmental aspects, at least 9 countries in 2019 have these incentives, and among them we have renewable energy and its usage, credit or reductions in terms of green technology, innovation, development, and research, or incentives for the use of green technologies, for example, electric cars. So this is more or less the trend in terms of tax incentives in taxes matters. So in terms of pollutant activities and the public spending dedicated to it, there are several estimates on what is this public spending. I have most of the many data that we can find, which is the Caribbean Monetary Union, that shows that the expenditure for this country ranges between 9.5% and 16%. So the size is still highly disputed, which is one of the topics that we should follow on. And we have once again the problem of transparency that we have just been talked about. So with the same overview, we have the cycle to 2003, the bullish one. So here we have tax amendments that increases the degree of dependence of this income of extractive activities between 2005 and 2008, and we saw that the prices represent more than 25% of the GDP in many countries of the region, which of course places us in a situation of dependence on this extraction income. Facing the exploitation of natural resources, we also see a tendency on contractual agreements that allow to exercise a higher control in, let's say, income, but this is still a dispute, and the contractual problems are still related to concessions. It is a dispute that's still ongoing. And in terms of royalties, to have a preference on local governments where extractions happen, and also in whatever relates its use. So we see here the inequalities, but because very little money is addressed for environment impact. So we see very little examples when we see that some money at all is being destined to these situations. And commercial and tariff restrictions for clean technology import. Except Costa Rica, there is an incipient participation in the negotiation of eliminating tariffs to ecologic products. So this is the overview that we are facing related to the principle, specifically principle number 4. Thank you, Natalia. I think that we are shaping now the scenario for a debate later on. So the numbers show the high dependence on oil projects, mining projects, to our economies, what they mean to our economies. So the complexity that they have in the regression of these taxes and the need to compensate it with other type of strategies, financial strategies, and also subsidies of fuels that turn out to be quite complex in this situation of fossil subsidized taxes. And what I just wrote that will give us the opportunity to discuss it later on are the high values that you were showing in terms of dependency, almost 50% in some countries. of their income come from that type of extractive activities. Colombia was not there, but we're around 12%, which has gone up to more even if you add hydrocarbons and mining activities. And it ends up being almost 12%, but there are other countries that have even 51%. And royalties has to be validated in territories. And those policies have to also be validated because they attempt to benefit municipalities and territories where this is done. And this long-term view, what's going to happen with those territories once minerals are not further bought or purchased, or when resources are finally depleted? And these transitions have happened. There's been an assignment of resources for this transformation. So this is more or less being shaped. Now I would like to pass the floor to Alejandro Rodriguez from Justicia, that's going to talk about green taxes and other tax environmental instruments as an environmental tool to move towards these just economies. Alejandro, please. Thank you, Mauricio. I'm going to share my presentation. You please tell me when you can see it. So can you see the presentation? And please remember to speak slowly for the interpreting services. Good day, everyone that are joining us today. So my presentation aims to talk a little bit about taxes and market regulation to guarantee the right to an environment. This presentation will focus on a document that I drafted as part of complement documents on the principles of human rights and tax policy that's been launched this week. And this is the way taxes and market redistribution could contribute guaranteeing human rights such as health, food, and environment. Health and food with healthy taxes and environment through green taxes. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the latter. So the idea here is that I'm going to briefly go over the document where the role of tax policy is discussed and the potential of tax policy to manage some of these incentives and market regulation should be taxes. So afterwards, talk about the theory behind these taxes and how they contribute to the guarantee of the right of environment. And we will talk about how tax is not an environmental situation only, but that's something that has been considered from human rights. And I will focus on implementation challenges and some of the guidelines that were the results of the analysis of the document. I think that in the document, you can also find the results of the experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I think that it is important to focus on the challenges that could appear in implementation and how to correct or address this through the guidelines that are presented. Some of the challenges, Natalia has already mentioned them during her presentation, so I would like to elaborate. So, as an introduction, I'd like to talk a little bit about tax policy's role. There are views on the roles that tax policy has in a society's economy. There are those who believe that tax policy roles should be neutral and should focus only on collecting and spending for the functioning and investments of the state, and that it should not involve or generate any type of changes in terms of economy or social aspects, and these are roles for other type of policies. So the document that's introduced as a complement of what has already been discussed is from a proactive role of tax policy, generating changes in demand or offer which stimulate not only economic growth, but also decision of market participants through price changing. Hence, the instruments that are the result of tax policies such as green taxes have the potential to incentivize or disincentivize conduct, and they have the potential to contribute to relative obligations, those relative to the performance of allowing people to have the right of a healthy environment. And here I'm limiting to taxes on emissions, taxes on one-use only plastic, but it is not enough. We only have a tax on pesticides that have the same logic behind it, behind the taxes that I just mentioned. And there are other type of taxes. In this presentation, I will focus mainly on these two taxes. So I believe that tax policy should be a regulatory means when detecting clear market failures that affect human rights. These market failures that can be detected in this particular case are negative externalities in the environment as a product of the non-regulated markets that generate carbon emissions, or the excessive production of one-use only plastic. So how do we carry out this regulatory exercise? Well, through Pigouvian taxes, which are taxes that aim to mitigate this negative externalization. So how do they achieve the mitigation of these negative externalities? Well, I want to discuss what has already been mentioned about public problem on the negative externality that Pigouvian taxes aim to correct. In 2018 reform, the government group of experts on climate change affirmed that the cost of having an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius in temperature of the world is going to be way more dramatic than what had been calculated and estimated. There is not a reduction despite the different agreements signed by different countries. For example, Kyoto Agreement and the Paris Agreement. So this is why different policies have been considered in order to face this social problem. The same thing with single-use plastic. Seed production has represented a growing problem in the last years. For example, in 2015, 300 million tons of plastic residues were generated, 79% laid in landfills, in the environment, or in strategic ecosystems, while approximately 12% was burned and only 9% was recycled. So as I mentioned before, taking into account these trends and this public problem, which is more bigger and bigger, different type of policies have been created to reduce the negative impacts of these markets. So the strategies have been focused on regulating through the creation of laws or acts or in command and control efforts. This has been relatively not enough. We're talking about decades. And there have been economic instruments created such as the Pigouvian taxes. What is this and what is its potential from the economic theory? Well, the potential of Pigouvian taxes are correcting the negative externalities produced by a market. When social marginal cost of production or consumption of an asset or a service or goes over the social marginal cost, then there is a negative externality that impacts people that are not within the market. A tax on the services that cause these externalities was increasing well-being when restricting the consumption and production until marginal cost is equal and this externality is compensated. So green taxes aim to reduce the negative effects of carbon emissions and climate change and the production of single-use plastics and its negative impact in oceans and strategic environments of the world. So these taxes increase the price of carbon emissions and plastics, which de-stimulates its production and its consumption, seeing that they are more expensive. And depending on the elasticity of these products or services, it is also disencouraged to offer it as well as its production. And of course, with this, what we generate is the mitigation or the reduction of the level of CO2 emissions or the production of single-use plastics. But besides this, there are other benefits. First, we get additional resources as a product of tax collection that could be invested to mitigate negative impacts caused by externality. In this case, the resources can be used for infrastructure to mitigate and adapt climate change and energy transition and other type of things that we will see later on the guidelines. But besides this, there is also something that's very important. And taxes increase prices, and prices have to do with incentives and with internalizing costs. So these taxes can internalize long-term costs that consumers do not take into account when buying products, or producers do not take into account when producing these products. This is because of information asymmetry. This means that they don't have enough information, or because of intertemporal patience. So this is a very interesting case because it is a global phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon and a long-term one. So market agents are not able to perceive costs as easily because they don't see it near nor soon enough. So what these taxes do are, when increasing the price, that producers can internalize them at the end of the day. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not a tax situation. And in the document, we do a systematic revision of the regulation that addresses tax matters related to environmental aspect. We find that the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from the UN, 42% of their final observations have been around climate change. And in these approaches, in this doctrine that they are developing in their state's assessment and during their declarations, they have shown how the use of these tax instruments could guarantee and protect the right to a healthy environment. For example, efficiently regulating the private sector so that their actions do not accelerate climate change, or thinking about policies that contribute to change consumption manners. For example, taxes that play with the incentives of market agents. So as the committee says, we can target the consumption. And also, the UN has talked about this. I would like to talk about extreme poverty and human rights report by the rapporteur that clearly mentions that tax policies and setting carbon prices could incentivize investment with low carbon emissions and mitigate emissions. Yes, once again, through the economic and tax instruments, they can incentivize and disincentivize the use of energy sources that's renewable as of fossil fuels, because, of course, these are taxed. Hence, they disincentivizes their production and their consumption. Now, as I said before, in order to make this presentation short, I'm not going to talk about the results in the implementation of these taxes in different countries. In the document that I invite you to go over, we systematize these results in order to show the impacts that it has had in emission reduction and single-use plastic emission. We have Ireland's case that has been quite acknowledged, or even Colombia's case with the tax on plastic bags and the positive results that it has had. But I would like to focus mainly on the challenges of the implementation that have been found in the study of these implementation cases. Now I want to talk specifically of three of them that are quite important, and I think that Natalia already mentioned them at some point. First is design and efficiency of the tax. This is very important since the design of the tax, especially the value of the ton of the carbon tax, has to incorporate the social cost, the social environmental cost that's generating the emissions so that they are effective. I mean, as you can see, the rates or the price of carbon below the social cost, well, a tax is not going to be efficient on this, and it won't be able to reach the environmental impact needed. And this is very important, and we've seen it in the Colombian case, where carbon tax and the price to carbon ton is 17,000 pesos, which is approximately $3 to $5, while the social cost has been calculated in approximately $25 or $50. So there is a huge difference that has to be corrected so that taxes are truly effective. Other situation are the distributive aspects. And the taxes on emissions or food could affect income. So this is very important to recycle taxes. So what can we do? And we can see also what has to be the investment of infrastructure to mitigate climate effects. And especially when to think about climate change infrastructure, because it benefits the vulnerable homes that are vulnerable the most to climate change. So let's say that the use of the resources is very important so that we can mitigate these possible impacts, negative distributive impacts. But also, it is very important to take into account the gradual implementation of these taxes so that they don't generate clashes in our homes. And last but not least, we need to take into account the effects in loss of competitivity in some sectors and emission leak to non-regulated markets. How these taxes fall over essential input on the production of services that could cause affectations in competitivity of some sectors, even what they call carbon leakage or carbon leakage. So emissions go to places where there is no tax. So we are only changing the point of emission, but nothing is being done with the size of the emission. So it is very important that we take into account these possible impacts in the productivity of sectors. And but also at the same time, what we've seen is that increases on energy costs improves the yield of some companies when generating work productivity and an additional profitability with technological changes. So this is also very important to take into account. And there is a World Bank study in competitivity in Mexico and Indonesia, emerging countries, so that it can be taken into account. How large would taxes be and the impact in competitivity? And last but not least, guidelines that go hand in hand with implementation challenges that we have identified. First of all, we will incorporate in its design the real social cost of carbon emissions or the negative externality that we are aiming to compensate with the green tax. As I already mentioned, if we are not able, then the measure could be ineffective. And besides this, it is very important that it is going to fall over all of the activities that generate negative environment impact. So the taxable tax on emissions incorporates all of the emission sources so that it is truly effective. And here, once again, we have the graduality of rates, application, and the cost of emissions, which is very important for it not to generate trauma and distributive affectations long term. And the second guideline is the usage of the recycling of the resources. So what's going to be done with the resources? So it is very important to design to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. This means to infrastructure related to this, but also to the energy transition of the economy so that sectors can be stimulated, those who are clean with these resources, but also to social transference in case of detecting regressive effects in taxes. For example, in simulations in Mexico to see how the net well-being after the transference tax is positive. There is a well-being in cost if we analyze it from well-being. But it is very important to take into account that these resources should not be considered long-term. I mean, they cannot be considered as indefinite. If these are not short or medium term, it is very important to discuss what is going to be done with them. Because if taxes are well designed, then resources are going to reduce long term because we are disincentivizing that activity. And it is very important to take that into account. Many people believe that these collection sources are defined. And if we need to achieve the purpose with green taxes, well, it is going to be lesser or non-existent long term. And last but not least, I think that a very important aspect related to the political economy behind these taxes is broadly socializing the benefits of these taxes to society, as well as the use of resources that's going to be given. So transparency in the use of resources. So I think that first of all, it reduces the pressures of interests or of the sectors that are going to be affected by these measures taken, and that are going to cause barriers for the implementation of these taxes. But besides this, they are going to get the public support. A way to do this will be applying some compensation measures to sectors and homes that could be affected, but before implementing these taxes. And I think that political economy behind this is quite important. We've seen how the implementation of green taxes has triggered social crisis in countries such as France, Ecuador, and now Colombia. And this has to do a lot with the lack of socializing taxes, and especially with a fundamental aspect that we need to take into account, which is the implementation of these taxes has to be done under social justice framework or tax justice framework, In the case of yellow vests in France, most of the discontent was that while they were implemented, they were reducing the tax to high value patrimonies, and something happened because of this. So it is very important to take this into account. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you so much, Alejandro. This is very interesting. And the need to do them a little bit more redistributive. So what you propose on the convenience to implement this type of taxes that could help generating transitions that are more adequate. However, they have to be very well designed in order not to generate some negative externalities or for them to compensate the negative externalities that have to be implemented in many of the sectors. So we were talking about single-use plastics. However, there are opportunities in other productive sectors, so they could be implemented there. And the convenience of reducing the negative impact, but for them to be designed properly so that it doesn't fall on part of the population that today have tax loads that are quite big already, or what are the weakest players of the chain, what is the weakest link, so we could consider the social clashes that happen eventually. There is something very interesting here, which is that having them fall over the right players, so not to generate those negative impacts, will make that recycling those products can bring to mitigation and adapting strategies to be easier. And the usage of these resources, and this is important because in Colombia there is a carbon tax, and it turns out that environmental sector are not receiving the resources and they haven't been executed. So it is not only collecting them, but also how they are going to be operative and if they are going to arrive, because we've had collection for 2 years, but right now carbon tax has not been seen in any improvement of the management of public entities. So this shows the need of transparency once again, which is a common factor So I would like to talk about an agreement that we have been trying for it to be ratified in Colombia, but there has been a resistance by productive sector, the largest ones in the country, absolutely opposing, and with a very complex problem in Congress. So there's a need to feasibilize this agreement and to provide more transparency to the use of these resources in order to improve tax and environment justice. So thank you so much, Alejandro, for your input. And well, now I would like to pass the floor to Ivana La Rosa from Collegial for Rights in Development. She's going to talk about, again, the coalition to monitor social impact and environmental impact of investments. So here we are having a very interesting point of view. So please go ahead. So thank you so much, everyone, for inviting us. As you very well said, with these very fruitful exchanges that are presenting the overview in a complex and rich way of interaction that we need in order to be able to act consequently. I'm going to try to share screen. Please tell me if you can see it here. Great. So now, as we were saying, I am the regional coordinator for Latin America of the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. And I want to tell you that this encompasses international organizations, base organizations, territorial organizations from different types. And we have 100 members. And the coalition aims to contribute generating actions and interactions and exchange of knowledge and with allies where they do not restrict only the membership to promote a development that's respectful of what communities, populations in different territories aim from development, to stress on that development based on human rights. And for this, of course, there is a very specific monitor, as you very well said during the presentation, of financial development institutions that are international, but also with the human rights framework, asking for accountability to governments and other private or non-state players that impact in the enjoyment of and the implementation of these rights. And as we said, focusing on people, communities, and the world, the planet. Evidently, from the coalition, we have this approach, this comprehensive approach that, of course, if we do not have access to a healthy environment, and if we do not guarantee that in our existence and in our capacity to enjoy our human rights today, and the ones that come in behind us, then we won't be able to talk about development in a sustainable way. So financial institutions, as most of you know, but just to frame it, are the institutions that provide credit, subventions, project investments, advice, policy advice, and that play a very important role in the type of development that our countries have, specifically not only in our region, but also at an international level. Among them, as we all know, we have the World Bank Group with the Financial International Corporation, the FMI, the IMF. We have regional banks in different regions, for example, the IATB and other banks. We also have national banks and institutions that are both nationals and from countries that operate in international cooperation. So they disburse funding or support for development activities. Many of the countries that these organizations support are very easy to see when we talk about infrastructure projects that are roads, dams. Well, these are projects that the population and the communities can see easily. And many times, because of the way they are constituted, the institutions and their policies, they are easily to monitor in terms of their impact, or try to follow their steps or ensure that follow their steps so that population and affected populations or communities in other countries can have an interaction. So this, of course, is still a challenge, as we will explain throughout the presentation. So this provides many examples where there are no proper consultations, where we don't have access to information timely and properly, which prevents and hinders this monitoring and this fiscalization by the civil society and the public in general. But there are other projects, other type of support and actions that these institutes develop that are harder to visualize in these terms, and that have to do with technical aspects, with policy or payment creation in certain sectors of our national development, and that also have to do with preparing recommendations and reports that directly impact on how policies are designed, on what type of sectors they emphasize in order to promote. And as we saw in previous presentations, this can be related to certain production sectors or in certain subventions or grants or incentives, and how the way they could negatively affect. So this type of advice and consultancy that development financial institutions do, along with states, many times with ministries of finance or the IRS, depending on the country, they design these policies, and the public policies and tax policies have many projects that have to do with tax reforms and environment reforms in all of the senses that we have been mentioning. So we find it quite important to place ourselves in the genesis of the characteristics of these institutions, because historically in the movement of human rights, maybe we haven't paid attention or we haven't emphasized enough on why these institutions have to be adhered to the principles of human rights, and why we as citizens interested in public matters that affect us have all the right to know what these institutions are doing, ask for accountability, etc. So these institutions are financed basically with money that the states contribute to. It is important to mention that states are members. They are the ones that in some way are owners in some way of these institutions, and they govern them. So the representatives of our states are parts of the directories of these institutions. So they carry with the responsibilities, because they are representing those states, and they are making decisions on behalf of those states that are our countries and that are part. So we will see that in the different institutions, there are different power balances with the countries that contribute from the point of view of funds, maybe developed countries that have a different investment flow, different from those countries that are emerging still. But actually, maybe that's another area that we need to pay close attention to, how this governance happens, the structure of international governance, and the implications of these institutions concretely, as well as those that are part of the decision-making. Also, the missions, why are these created? Why are they there, and what do they do? What's the mandate of these institutions? Well, of course, we are going to find in community, in the IMF, in the IATB, all of them are referencing public interest without being created to contribute nothing more than sustainable development, eradicating poverty, to be aligned with a development that contemplates what each country understands to be their priorities and others. So that's why I wanted to show you this characteristics very quickly, because this is what we need to take into account and bear in mind to remember, to analyze, and to design even advocacy strategies and for accountability from these institutions. So, as we were saying, the state members of these institutions need to fulfill these obligations in terms of international institution of human rights, regardless if they're the ones that provide money or receive it. So if they are donors or receivers. So as a consequence, what we wanted to stress on is, well, respecting the rights frameworks. As many has already mentioned in today's presentation and already from Monday, all of the principles of human rights, principles of equality, non-discrimination, truly working for a substantial equality. See how the situations that they're promoting, investments that they've been trying to frame, the type of technical advice and consultancy and what those states receiving these are promoting, they truly could meet, and they do not negatively impact. Well, they do not only impact negatively, but they don't. We also see what has already been discussed in our presentations. It is not enough that there are not negative impacts being generated, but to truly see that they have access to rights in a sustainable way, and to promote all of the guarantees among them, especially for them not to be measures that are non-regressive or that have an impact in certain sectors, because if we don't have a comprehensive test, then even if you have the best will and the best intentions, maybe you can end up impacting the populations that are already vulnerable because of other actions, or because there is an inequality, a structural inequality that historically hasn't been solved by the market, and that they won't be able to solve it from the states and from the institutions that these states integrate, and for them to be aligned to rights and what they need to promote for this. So based on these obligations, based on these obligations and treaties that we've already mentioned, they develop their own policies that are called safeguards, that aim to protect negative impacts, ensure that they are considering social impacts, environmental impacts, rights impacts, the specific aspects that indigenous peoples explain, for example, or the Afro-descendant peoples explain, from a vision of gender impact maybe, or intersectionality. And this has been, of course, taking into account work and pressure from civil society and the affected communities that have been applying more and more pressure to have these policy frameworks, these safeguards frameworks that these institutions have, and that also incorporate what we were saying and what you mentioned before, everything related to transparency, to information access, to previous informed consent, that, as I said before, in many cases we see that this fails permanently. And that later on we need to turn to international mechanisms. And many times there's a separation between what those mechanisms consider and how they work in terms of when we introduce complaints in the universal or regional system of human rights. This is something that we need to take into account, that this is part of this monitoring and advocacy pressure work that civil society is still doing. So in these policies, and just to mention some of them that are relevant to our region, the IATP recently updated the new environmental and social policy. So in this policy that they acknowledge and mention several of the situations that we've been discussing, has created a plan to cross-sectionalize all of these policies, guidelines, this true framework throughout all of the bank's activities. So very briefly, I want to show you what they have shared in this. So the cross-sectionality plan here is expanding and improving quality in the operational and analytical activity by the bank, taking into account environmental sustainability in the process of the development of IATB countries. Also, the IATB has committed to increase environmental and social results of the work to do good and minimize negative impacts in human rights and in the environment. So here we see that there are efforts, of course, developed with different technical people that work in policies. There are consultations in civil society. Also, the members of the coalition have participated in providing their input when this environmental and social policy was created. But there's always a challenge of implementation, as it happens with all of the human rights treaties and agreements. We reach certain situations, we reach certain visions, shared visions. However, there's a huge challenge on how this is truly implemented. And in terms of development institutions, we see that these guidelines, these frameworks, these policies exist, but it is an everyday work to monitor and ensure that this is cross-sectionalized and that this is truly implemented in matters that collect resources and how public debt is generated and what is prioritized in countries to see the true environmental social impact and to see how tax policies are truly an instrument, as we say, in order to have genuine resources and that do not generate negative impacts or that are still having costs falling on the communities that pay the worst or are in more vulnerable situations. So on these policies, in order to see the impact on these tax policies, which is the goal of this morning, is that some of the services that we were saying, we have different actions that development institutions do. And among them, we have consultancy services that many times they are concretely targeted to promote innovation, investment, generate exchanges and solutions, to manage public spending, policy management. But of course, there's always a question that comes up. How can we guarantee that these reforms proposed, incentivized, or designed or co-designed with these institutions are truly going to have a positive impact in the most vulnerable communities? Or as we've seen in other panels where we talk about that when generating investments and this public debt being generated in certain contexts, how is social expenditure being prioritized with respect of using the funds that countries have in order to keep on paying the public debt? When we generate more expenditure in paying this debt compared to the benefits that it would supposedly offer when acquiring that debt, that we're in troubles. And if we don't know how these priorities are being taken, both from our states and from under the framework of the treaties or the cooperation or the consultancy of these institutions, then it becomes quite hard. So these sectors are also defined as priority. So based on the examples that you brought, when we define certain productive sectors or financing efforts, then doors are being opened to have private players to play a very important role in those sectors. Many times, public services are flexibilized that have human rights as a basis. And it has also been proposed, as it has been mentioned before, to restructure or to have structures that have to do with austerity mechanisms that directly impact social sectors that need the most the need of the state to guarantee our rights. So these are the questions that are always resonating in our work to say, how can we monitor this? It is a complex task. Tax policies, as we said, is an instrument to get the right resources for the implementation of mechanisms and policies that guarantee human rights. So the current climate crisis is seen as as a fundamental situation, having resources and having the right priorities, and that the tax policy does not mean only having resources, but for that policy to shape the way the activities are going to be, so we can truly have a development in this sustainable. And sorry for interrupting. We have to conclude. We have to close. Sorry, I'm so sorry, but we need to close. Okay, so I just want to share some of the examples that I see that are worthwhile to have. Part of these development policies promoted by banks are the World Bank, that at times do not apply the same safeguards for the project and the infrastructure we were saying. There are some examples where the bank itself assessed and detected that not the same safeguards are applied. We have examples, for example, in Colombia, of territorial governance that have affected Afro-Colombian or indigenous peoples. And to conclude, we need for institutions and for all of the intermediaries or clients to meet human rights needs. Of course, you were talking about principles 13 and 14 in a generalized way, and then in detail about the guidelines, but it applies to other principles. And a key point is access to information, participation, and what we were saying of transparency and the possibility of having a due diligence with these previous assessment previous to any of these incentives or projects that these institutions promote, and they had a CASU agreement, which is another important tool that talks about active transparency. So generating data so that people and audience in general can monitor and be true participants and not only react to financial impact. This is my contact info, and thank you very much. Thank you, Ivan. I'm so sorry that I interrupted you. I think that the topics are very interesting, all of them, and time just started going by the hour and a half that we have considered. And what they consider is very important. And this is the entity that funds, but do not consider the accountability that they should have towards citizenship. So as you very well say, they are funded with our resources, with our country's resources. So they should include, and they have been generators of huge asymmetries, as you very well say. So at times they fund environmental aspects, but in turn you see the amounts of environmental amounts or the amount of mega infrastructure that generates conflict, or the worst case scenario, you see tax policies that are regressive, and without thinking in all of it that we were talking about energy transition and all of that, and with the net results that we have in Latin America of inequality, of Gini index, Latin America, along with African countries being the most inequitable countries. So it seems that their goals are not being achieved. So I think that what you're proposing here on the need to apply pressure for accountability from civil society and from the organizations that are represented here, it is fundamental. Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry for having interrupting you. We are going to conclude with an illustration that Andrea Medina did of a summary of what we've been discussing. Unfortunately, we won't have time for a Q&A session. It was quite interesting. The debate was quite interesting. So Andrea, I give you the microphone now. Hello, thank you. So you can see the progress of today. It's almost done. So we can see most of human rights and the need to identify gaps and opportunities and the principles and the needs to assess all of the factors that advocate over these principles that should ensure policies and for them to adhere to a sustainable effort. Indicators, variables of these financial entities, and the proactive role of the tax policy, green taxes, and we were talking about the importance and the financial development institutions and the results and challenges of these tax policies, because we need to design those taxes in a more efficient way, and the distributive efforts and the efforts in terms of competitivity laws. So, yeah, this illustration is quite interesting. Your feedback is quite interesting, Andrea. And I think that this is going to be available for all of us. And I think that this has helped sum up the discussions and the expositions and presentations that we've been having. All of them quite interesting. Once again, apologies for not being able to generate a discussion opportunity. There was a lot of information and presentations were longer. But thank you so much on behalf of the organizations that we've been supporting this event. And we would like to invite you to continue accompanying the meetings during this week. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, all panel members, and for your amazing presentations. My God. Thank you so much. I don't know, Sergio, if you have any comments. No, thank you. Just remind you that we have an opportunity to continue these conversations via Twitter, in Twitter Spaces. So every day at 1 p.m. Colombia, Mexico, 2 p.m. Chile, 3 p.m. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. And just to reiterate our appreciation for our panel members and their amazing presentations, as well as Andrea for the illustration and as well as the interpreters. And thank you so much for being here.